There's a moment you've felt but never named. You're standing in a room full of people, and someone asks you how your weekend was, and something inside you, freezes. Not because you don't remember, not because you're shy, but because the question itself feels like it's asking you to participate in a ritual you no longer believe in. You open your mouth to say it was good, and the words taste like ash. Like a lie you're telling not to them, but to yourself. And in that silence, that fraction of a second before you force out the expected response, you feel it. A strange grief. A mourning for a version of you that could have answered that question without this weight. You've changed. Something in you has shifted so fundamentally that the surface of life no longer holds you. And no one told you this would happen. No one warned you that seeking depth would make the shallows unbearable. This is the cost no one talks about. The hidden price of becoming someone who feels too much, thinks too deeply, and can no longer pretend that the trivial matters. You didn't choose to become this way. Or maybe you did, in 1,000 small decisions every book you read. Every night you stayed awake questioning everything. Every moment you chose truth over comfort. And now, here you are, unable to participate in conversations that once felt normal. Feeling like an outsider in gatherings that should feel like home. Wondering if something is wrong with you, or if something is finally, terrifyingly right. Today, we're going to explore something that lives in the shadows of personal transformation. We're going to talk about why the pursuit of meaning, the very thing that's supposed to make life richer, can also make it lonelier. Why depth, that precious thing we chase, comes with an isolation that no one prepares you for. And most importantly, we're going to ask whether this is a wound that needs healing, or a sign that you've outgrown a world that was never meant to contain you. Let's begin with a confession that might sound familiar. There was a time when small talk was easy, when you could spend an evening discussing nothing, the weather, celebrity gossip, complaints about work, and leave feeling satisfied. Not fulfilled perhaps, but satisfied. Like eating fast food, it filled the space, it served its purpose. You didn't question it because you didn't know there was anything to question, but something happened. Maybe it was gradual, a slow awakening over years. Maybe it was sudden, triggered by loss, by crisis, by a single conversation that cracked open something inside you. Whatever the catalyst, you crossed a threshold, and thresholds, by their very nature, only allow passage in one direction. You cannot unknow what you now know. You cannot unfeel what you have felt. The door behind you has closed, and the room you left, that room of easy conversations and surface connections, no longer has space for who you've become. This is the paradox of awakening that ancient philosophers understood but rarely spoke about directly. Epicurus, who is so often misunderstood as the champion of pleasure, knew this truth intimately. His garden in Athens wasn't a place of indulgence, it was a refuge, a sanctuary for people who had realized that the pleasures society offered were not pleasures at all, but distractions dressed in pleasant clothing. He gathered around him not hedonists in the modern sense, but refugees. People who could no longer participate in the shallow games of Athenian social life. People who had tasted something real and found that everything else had become unbearable by comparison. What Epicurus understood, and what you're perhaps beginning to understand now, is that true pleasure ataraxia, that profound tranquility of soul, cannot coexist with pretense. The moment you begin to live authentically, the inauthentic becomes not just unappealing, but painful. Small talk isn't just boring to you now. It hurts. It feels like a betrayal of something sacred. And this is not a flaw in your character. This is the natural consequence of having touched something genuine. Consider what happens when you've experienced real connection. When you've had a conversation that made time disappear. When someone looked into your eyes and saw you, not the role you play, not the mask you wear, but the raw, trembling truth of who you are. After that, how can you go back to discussing the weather? How can you pretend that surface-level exchanges nourish you when you've tasted the feast of genuine intimacy? You can't. And this is your gift and your burden. The burden is real. Let's not romanticize this. There's a loneliness that comes with depth that can feel crushing. You watch others connect easily, laugh at jokes that don't reach you, engage in conversations that seem to satisfy them, and you wonder, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just be normal? Why does everything have to be so heavy, so meaningful, so intense? These questions aren't signs of arrogance. They're the cries of someone who feels increasingly alien in a world they once belonged to. And if you've been feeling this, if these words are landing somewhere deep in your chest, maybe it's time to join the space where we go deeper every week. You know where the button is? Because this conversation is just beginning, and the territory we're entering requires companions who understand the terrain. Let's talk about what's actually happening beneath the surface of your discomfort with small talk, because it's not really about small talk at all. Small talk is just the symptom, the disease if we can call it, that is a fundamental restructuring of your value system. You have, whether consciously or not, begun to prioritize authenticity over social ease, truth over comfort, depth over breadth, and these priorities come with costs that no one advertises. Think about it this way. Most social interactions operate on an unspoken contract. I'll pretend to be interested in your surface, and you'll pretend to be interested in mine. We'll exchange pleasantries like currency, and both of us will walk away feeling that we've participated in the human ritual of connection without ever actually connecting. This contract works beautifully, as long as both parties believe in it. As long as neither party has realized that the currency is counterfeit, but you've realized, you've seen through the contract, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every shallow conversation becomes a performance you can no longer commit to. Every surface exchange feels like a tiny death, a moment where you abandon yourself to maintain social harmony, and your soul, that deep, wordless part of you that knows what's true, begins to rebel. It refuses to keep playing a game that costs you your integrity. Nietzsche, that great disturber of comfortable illusions, wrote about this exact phenomenon. He spoke of the herd, not with contempt, but with a kind of sorrowful understanding. The herd isn't stupid. The herd isn't evil. The herd is simply everyone who hasn't yet realized that the values they've inherited might not be their own. And when you begin to question those inherited values, when you start asking whether the life you're living is the fun life you actually want, you step outside the herd, not above it, outside it. And outside is cold. Outside is lonely. Outside is where you wonder if the warmth of belonging was worth more than the truth you've found. But here's what Nietzsche also understood. You cannot go back. This is perhaps the cruelest part of awakening. It's irreversible. You can pretend. You can force yourself through the motions of small talk, nodding and smiling and saying all the right things. But you'll feel it's that splinter in your soul, that silent scream of inauthenticity. And over time, the pretending will cost you more than the isolation ever could. Because pretending requires you to betray yourself, and self-betrayal is a wound that never heals. So, what do? How do you navigate a world that runs on surface when you can only survive in the depths? This is the question that haunts everyone who has crossed this threshold, and there's no easy answer. But there is an answer, and it begins with understanding that your discomfort with small talk isn't a problem to be fixed. It's a compass, pointing you toward a different kind of life. Let's explore what that different kind of life might look like. First, we need to dispel a myth. The myth is that people who can't do small talk are somehow socially deficient, that we lack some essential skill that others possess. This is backwards. The truth is that we possess something, a sensitivity, an awareness, a depth of feeling that makes certain social rituals unbearable. We're not missing something, we're carrying something extra. And that extra weight, while it makes casual interaction difficult, also makes profound connection possible. Think about the conversations that do nourish you. They exist. They're rare, but they exist. Moments when someone drops their mask and you drop yours. Moments when the conversation ventures into territory that matters: love, death, meaning, fear, hope, the strange miracle of being alive. In those moments, you're not awkward. You're not struggling. You're home. You're more yourself than you ever are in the shallow waters of small talk. This tells you something important. You're not broken. You're specialized. You're designed for a kind of connection that most people never experience because they're too busy maintaining the surface. The ancient Epicureans had a word for this kind of connection: philia letters, deep friendship. Not the casual acquaintanceship that passes for friendship in modern life, but something far more rare and precious. Friendship that's built on shared pursuit of truth. Friendship that can hold the weight of real conversation. Friendship that nourishes instead of depletes. Epicurus believed that this kind of friendship was essential to the good life, not optional, not a luxury, but essential, and he was right. Here's what I want you to consider. Maybe your inability to do small talk isn't a social handicap. Maybe it's a filter. Maybe it's your soul's way of refusing to waste your limited time on Earth in exchanges that leave you emptier than you started. Maybe the discomfort you feel in shallow conversation is actually a form of wisdom, the recognition that your energy is precious and shouldn't be spent on counterfeit currency. This doesn't mean you should become a hermit. This doesn't mean you should reject all social interaction. But it does mean you can stop blaming yourself for something that isn't a flaw. It does mean you can start seeking out the people and places where real connection is possible. And it means you can begin to build a life that honors your depth instead of punishing it. And if this perspective is shifting something in you, if you're beginning to see your struggle in a new light, I hope you'll consider staying with this conversation. Not just today, but in the weeks and months to come. Because we're building something Hera community of people who refuse to live on the surface. And you might just find that you're not as alone as you thought. Let's go deeper still. Let's talk about what happens to your relationships when you can no longer do small talk. Because this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where the abstract becomes painfully concrete. You probably have people in your life who you love but can no longer reach. Family members, perhaps old friends, people you share history with but no longer share depth with. And there's a grief in this that's hard to articulate. You sit across from someone you've known for decades, and you feel a canyon between you. Not because either of you has done anything wrong, but because you've traveled to a place they haven't been. You've changed in ways they can't see. And the language you now speak, the language of meaning and depth and existential questioning, sounds like gibberish to ears that have never heard it. This is one of the hidden costs of transformation. The people who knew the old you often can't recognize the new you, and sometimes they don't want to. Your growth confronts them with their own stasis. Your questions make them uncomfortable because they've worked very hard to avoid those questions. Your depth feels like a judgment, even when you intend nothing of the sort. And so they pull away, or you pull away, or you both pretend nothing has changed while the distance between you grows. I want to validate how painful this is. I want to acknowledge that there are days when you wonder if the depth was worth the loss. Days when you would give anything to go back to easy conversations with people you love. Days when the isolation feels like too high a price for the truth you've found. These days are real. This pain is real. And no philosophy can make it disappear entirely. But here's what philosophy can offer: context, understanding, a framework that helps you make sense of what's happening. Seneca, that great Stoic who understood loneliness perhaps better than any ancient thinker, wrote letters to a friend named Lucilius. These letters are essentially a manual for living with depth in a shallow world, and one of Seneca's recurring themes is this: the path of wisdom is the path of increasing solitude, not because the wise person rejects others, but because wisdom changes what you need from others, and what you need becomes increasingly rare. Seneca didn't see this as a tragedy. You saw it as a trade. You exchange quantity for quality. You exchange many shallow connections for a few deep ones. You exchange the comfort of the herd for the companionship of genuine friends. And this trade, while it costs you dearly, also gives you something priceless: relationships that actually nourish your soul. Think about it this way: a shallow relationship is like junk food. It fills you up temporarily, but it leaves you malnourished. You can have 100 shallow relationships and still be starving for real connection. A deep relationship, on the other hand, is like a feast. One is enough. One can sustain you through years of isolation. One can make the loneliness bearable because you know that somewhere in the world, someone truly sees you. This is the reorientation that your inability to do small talk is pushing you toward. It's forcing you to stop investing in junk food and start seeking feasts. It's demanding that you stop spreading yourself thin across countless surface connections and start going deep with the few people who can meet you there. This is painful. Yes, but it's also liberation. It's permission to stop performing. It's permission to stop pretending. It's permission to finally be yourself with people who can handle your true self. Now, let's address something that might be bubbling up in you. A resistance. A voice that says, "But I have to do small talk. I have to function in the world. I have to interact with colleagues, acquaintances, strangers. I can't just opt out of surface conversation entirely." This is true. And I'm not suggesting you become a recluse. What I'm suggesting is something more nuanced. I'm suggesting you approach small talk not as a participation, but as a navigation. You move through it. You don't invest in it. You recognize it for what it is: a social lubricant, a ritual, a way of establishing basic human acknowledgement without expecting it to nourish you, and, crucially, without blaming yourself when it doesn't. There's a skill here that can be developed. The skill is not becoming better at small talk. The skill is becoming at peace with your relationship to small talk. Accepting that it will never satisfy you, accepting that you'll often feel like an outsider in casual social situations, accepting that this is the price of the depth you carry, and then doing it anyway, when necessary, without resistance and without self-judgment. Imagine approaching a cocktail party or a work function not as a test you're destined to fail, but as a foreign country you're passing through. You don't expect to understand all the customs. You don't expect to feel at home. You simply navigate with as much grace as you can, knowing that your real home is elsewhere. This shift in perspective doesn't make small talk enjoyable, but it makes it bearable, and sometimes bearable is enough. Here's something else that might help. In the midst of small talk, you can look for opportunities to go deeper. Not aggressively, not in a way that makes others uncomfortable, but gently. A question that invites a real answer, a moment of genuine curiosity about the person in front of you. Most people, even those who seem content with surface conversation, have depths they rarely share. And sometimes, a single authentic question can crack open an unexpected connection. I've watched this happen. Two people stuck in the ritual of small talk, and one of them asks something real. What's been on your mind lately? Or what do you really think about that? And suddenly the conversation shifts. Suddenly there's something alive between them. Not everyone will respond to this invitation. Many will retreat back to the surface, uncomfortable with the sudden depth. But some will lean in, some will meet you there. And those are your people. Those are the ones worth finding. If you've stayed with me this far, you're clearly one of those people. One of the ones who wants more than surface. One of the ones willing to explore the uncomfortable questions. And I want you to know that this journey we're on together, this exploration of depth and meaning, and the strange loneliness of awakening it, continues every week. So, if you haven't already, now might be the time to become part of this ongoing conversation. Let's turn now to something even more challenging. Let's talk about the role of pleasure in all of this. Because that's ostensibly what hedonism is about, right? Pleasure? Except the word has been so corrupted, so misunderstood, that we need to rescue it before we can use it. When most people hear hedonism, they think of excess, indulgence, chasing sensation, without regard for consequence. But this is a modern distortion. Ancient hedonism, the hedonism of Epicurus, the hedonism that forms the philosophical backbone of this conversation, was almost the opposite. It was about understanding pleasure so deeply that you could distinguish between pleasures that nourish and pleasures that deplete, between pleasures that lead to tranquility and pleasures that lead to chaos. And here's what Epicurus discovered. The deepest pleasures are not sensory at all. The deepest pleasures are relational and existential. The pleasure of genuine friendship, the pleasure of understanding, the pleasure of living in accordance with your true nature. These pleasures don't shout. They don't seduce. They don't demand your attention with flashing lights and immediate gratification. But they satisfy in a way that no sensory pleasure ever can. This connects directly to your struggle with small talk. What you're experiencing is a realignment toward genuine pleasure. Your soul has tasted what's real, and it can no longer stomach what's fake. The discomfort you feel in shallow conversation is actually a form of pleasure-seeking. You're seeking the pleasure of authentic connection, and you're refusing to accept substitutes. This is hedonism in its truest form. Not indulgence, but discernment. Not chasing every pleasure, but knowing which pleasures are worth chasing. Your inability to do small talk isn't a social failing. It's evidence that your internal pleasure compass has become more sophisticated. You can no longer be fooled by counterfeit satisfactions. You can no longer pretend that surface interactions leave you fulfilled when they leave you empty. But this is crucial. This sophistication comes with responsibility. Once you know what real pleasure is, you can't just avoid the fake stuff. You have to actively pursue the real stuff. You have to structure your life around the kinds of connections that actually nourish you. Otherwise, you'll end up in the worst of both worlds, unable to enjoy surface pleasures, but also not experiencing deep pleasures, just isolated, just alone, just starving. This is the work. This is what your transformation is calling you to do. Not just to recognize what doesn't satisfy you, but to go find what does, to seek out people who can meet your depth, to create contexts where authentic conversation is possible, to build, slowly and intentionally, a life rich in the pleasures that matter. Let me offer some practical thoughts on how to do this. First, recognize that depth-capable people are rare but not non-existent. They're out there. They're probably feeling just as alone as you are. They're probably having the same struggle with small talk. And they're probably longing for someone who gets it. Your job is not to convert surface people into depth people. That's neither possible nor your responsibility. Your job is to find the people who are already there. Where are they? Often in places and activities that select for reflection. Book clubs, but the serious kind, philosophy discussion groups, meditation communities, art spaces, grief support groups, anywhere that people have been broken open by life and are trying to make sense of the pieces. Not everyone in these spaces will be your person, but the probability is higher than in random social situations. Second, be willing to go first. In the early stages of a potential friendship, someone has to take the risk of depth. Someone has to ask the real question, share the real thought, reveal the real vulnerability. Often, both people are waiting for the other to go first, and the connection never happens because neither one takes the risk. Be the one who takes the risk. You'll be rejected sometimes. You'll scare some people off. But the ones who meet you, those connections will be worth every rejection. Third, be patient. Deep friendship takes time. You can't rush intimacy without making it performative. What you can do is create the conditions for depth to emerge naturally. Regular contact, shared experiences, conversations that return to important topics over time, trust that builds gradually through consistent authenticity. The feast of deep friendship isn't something you can order on demand. It's something that cooks slowly over years. And finally, let yourself grieve what you've lost. This is important and often overlooked. The ease you used to have with small talk, the belonging you used to feel in shallow social situations, the old friendships that can no longer hold who you've become, these losses are real. They deserve to be mourned. You're not weak for feeling sad about them. You're not failing by wishing things were different. You're human. And part of being human is grieving the selves we've outgrown and the connections that couldn't make the journey with us. If you're with me in this grief, if you know this particular sadness, I want you to know you're not alone. Every person who has woken up to depth has felt it. And while we can't take the sadness away, we can hold it together. That's part of what this space is for, to be companions to each other in the hard parts of the journey. So stay with us, stay in this conversation, and let's keep going deeper together. Let me take you somewhere personal now. Because philosophy isn't just ideas, it's lived experience. And my own relationship with small talk has been a source of confusion and pain for longer than I'd like to admit. I remember the first time I noticed something had changed. I was at a party, the kind of party I used to enjoy, and I found myself unable to enter conversations. Not because I was anxious, not because I didn't know people there, but because every conversation I approached felt ... hollow. Like watching television with the sound off. I could see the movements, observe the gestures of social connection, but I couldn't find my way into them. I felt like a ghost, present but not participating, visible but not seen. That night, I went home early and sat in the dark for a long time, trying to understand what was wrong with me. I blamed myself. I thought I had developed some kind of social disorder. I thought I needed to fix myself to recover whatever capacity I had lost. It took me years to realize that nothing was wrong. Something was right. I had simply changed, and the social world I had known hadn't changed with me. This is the strange paradox of growth. The very thing that makes you more alive can also make you feel more isolated. The very thing that opens you to deeper truths can close you off from easier ones. You gain something profound and lose something comfortable, and no one tells you this is part of the deal. I share this not for sympathy, but for recognition. I know many of you are in this same strange place, wondering what's wrong with you, blaming yourself for a transformation you didn't choose, feeling the loneliness of depth in a world that rewards surface. I want you to know that you're not broken. I want you to know that this is a real phenomenon with real causes. And I want you to know that it's possible to build a life that honors your depth instead of punishing it. Not easy, not quick, but possible. Let's talk about something that might seem counterintuitive: the value of solitude. Because when you can no longer do small talk, you spend more time alone. And this can feel like failure, like evidence that something is wrong. But what if it's actually an opportunity? Nietzsche, again, is helpful here. He wrote about the value of solitude for the deep thinker, not as isolation, but as incubation. Space to think thoughts that can only emerge in silence. Time to digest experiences that need slow processing. Freedom from the constant pressure to perform social normalcy. Nietzsche saw solitude not as a problem to be solved, but as a condition to be cultivated. This doesn't mean you should romanticize loneliness. Loneliness, the painful kind, the kind that aches, is real and deserves compassion. But solitude chosen, intentional time alone, can be something different entirely. It can be the space where you come home to yourself, the space where you don't have to translate your depths into the shallow language of small talk, the space where you can simply be, without performing. I'm suggesting a reframe. What if some of the alone time that results from your inability to do small talk is actually nourishing? What if it's giving you something that constant social interaction would take away? What if your soul needs this silence more than you realize? The Stoics had a practice called turning inward. In the midst of a busy world, they would retreat into their own minds, finding stillness in the center of chaos. They didn't see this as escape, they saw it as homecoming. And for those of us who can no longer find home in shallow social interaction, learning to find home in ourselves might be essential. This isn't about choosing isolation over connection. It's about recognizing that not all time alone is the same. Some of it is painful loneliness. Some of it is nourishing solitude. Learning to tell the difference and to cultivate the second while honoring the pain of the first is a skill that can transform your experience. Here's a practice that might help. When you find yourself alone, ask yourself, is this loneliness or solitude? Loneliness feels like lack, like something missing, like reaching for connection and finding empty space. Solitude feels like fullness, like presence, like being complete without needing anything external.